Take that up. We have two motions that Councillor Taylor had submitted that we're going to give her an opportunity to put on the table. And we're also going to expect Mayor Piercy to phone in because she wanted to be a part of the conversation for these first items. She's not here yet.
I'll wait for her.
So, well, I think we can get the conversation started and she can join us in progress. So, Councillor Taylor, I will give you the floor.
Make the first one now. I move that the city support legislation to repeal the statutory prohibition on inclusionary zoning.
Second.
Thank you. Some time ago, the legislature enacted a ban on inclusionary zoning, which said that cities cannot do it. It is, in case you don't know what it is, it's a way of causing mixed incomes in any development. It could be apartment building, condos, houses, and if we repeal the ban, it doesn't mean that we're going to do it or allow it even. It could usually or frequently it's voluntary, but many cities use this as a way of mixing housing, which is really healthy for everybody, especially healthy for children, I think, to have mixed incomes, not identified, but just mixed in. And this is a part, not only is it a good thing, but it's a good thing for us to be able to do what we want. We all believe in home rule for cities, I think. And it is very strange that the legislature would say we cannot do this. I think it's a good time to try this with the current legislature. Thank you.
Great. And Mayor Piercy, did you join us on the phone?
I did.
All right.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And George, you're next. George Brown.
Thank you.
motion?
Well, I'll support this motion.
Oh, yeah, the motion's out.
The motion's on the table. Okay.
Got a second.
Yeah, I'll support this.
In the queue.
It's strange that it takes away cities' freedoms to decide on how they want to handle their housing problems. If the legislature were to overturn this ban on inclusionary zoning, it doesn't necessarily mean that Portland and Salem and Eugene and every city would immediately, come up with ordinances and making it mandatory. I've been studying Montgomery County, Maryland's inclusion. They've had inclusionary zoning for quite some time, and it seems to have really been beneficial in supplying more affordable and workforce housing in a nice mix. And Montgomery County is where Bethesda is. It's I don't know if you're familiar with the D.C. area, but it's a pretty populous county, and it seems to have been a very good program. And I imagine it was probably opposed by the development community initially, but now that it's been in effect for quite some time and people are used to it, and it's just how they build housing now. And I think given that, the housing crisis in general is nationwide, really it's worldwide. Affordable housing is a huge problem in the United States. It's a really big problem here in Eugene. 60% of the population here is rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 30% of their income on their housing. And like I say, it doesn't automatically stand that if the legislature were to overturn this, that Eugene would adopt, an inclusionary zoning ordinance. But I think that we should study it, and I think the state should overturn it. That would allow other communities to deal with their housing problems in a, pretty innovative way that's worked well in other communities around the country. So I will support this motion. Thank you.
All right. And just to clarify, since Councillor Taylor's motion wasn't explicit, what we're talking about is having our city lobbyist in Salem actively support this legislation. So that's what the intent of the motion is. Councillor Clark.
I think
I apologize. I think Councilor Pulling had his hand up before me. I'd let him go before me if you want. Oh, okay. I would say that I'm not in favor of supporting this. I don't have any, I don't harbor any illusions that the legislature will repeal this, but I think it's a bad policy idea. I'm in favor of the kinds of things that give people incentive to do more than they're required to do, that give people the incentive to follow the planning guidelines and the things that the work that we do around community planning, and that we're going to hear about a little later. And George and I talked about some of those things around the discussion that we had with regard to MUPD, and creating incentives is a good way to go. But the need for MUPD is a bummer in the first place. It's a bad thing. And it's driven by not just high land costs for redevelopment in our core, but by over-regulation. And that's what this is. Inclusionary zoning dictates too much about how things need to be built and makes them much more expensive to do. And then at the end of the day, you end up needing more incentives and tax breaks like MUPD just to make something get built according to our planning. So I can't support extending and increasing the regulatory environment in our community.
George?
Thank you. Yeah, I can't support it either. I think the prohibition is a good idea. Some of what Mike said, this will constrict the development of market rate housing in Eugene by causing developers to build in jurisdictions close by us without the inclusionary zone. It'll also, by constraining the supply of housing, the inclusionary zone programs will cause the market rate housing prices here in Eugene to go up. There was a study done by the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy in New York University, and the data they have on the studies that they've done on the cities that have inclusionary zones are all over the map. Some of them do show some success. A good example of one that doesn't is Boston. They can't account for any units, affordable housing units, built in Boston because of the inclusionary zone. And in this study, they warned that a one-size-fits-all does not work for an inclusionary zone, and that it's going to take hours and hours and months of staff time to develop individual regulations for each individual jurisdiction based on a lot of different things. And I think that it's kind of unfair to place a majority of the burden of providing affordable housing units on the developers and buyers of market rate housing, although we work with like St. Vincent's and some of the other nonprofits to help with affordable housing. I think this will drive a majority of the burden to the private developers. But the thing that really concerns me is the lack of conclusive data that they were able to come up with. It just is. There's just too many unknowns in the systems. So I can't support removing, having our lobbyists go up to Salem and lobby for removing the prohibition.
Can I get in the queue, please?
Yeah, I'll put you in the queue, Mayor. Chris?
Thank you. I appreciate the perspectives on both sides. I think there is persuasive and reasonable points of view on both sides. I tend to approach this not as a regards to a specific piece of zoning that's being considered, but as a general concept about home rule versus state control. In fact, both of these items that are being proposed by Councilor Taylor are examples of some things should operate at the local level and some things should operate at the state level reasonably. Some things should be administered at the state level. Some things should be administered closer to home. And I think this item, I may vote no on every single example should it ever come up. But I think the notion that having what your zoning regulations are operated at the state level or controlled at the state level or managed at the state level as opposed to at the local level is not the system I would necessarily endorse. So I will support this only from the philosophical standpoint that I'd like to have these kinds of decisions made at a local level. Not to say that I would support if it didn't seem like it was a reasonable thing to do, But with that said, I don't want to even have this little bitty taste in the back of my mouth that we're supporting the institutionalization of some kind of discrimination. I'm not saying anybody here that's their intent, but that it could be. It could be used for that purpose if you wanted to go down that road. And I'm not thinking anybody wants to go down that road, but you could go down that road. And so having the ability at the local level to make those kind of decisions about whether it is or whether it isn't, or whether you're using that tool well or not using that tool well, is something I would want to do here instead of in Salem. So I will support it, probably not for the reasons that other people might support it, but I will support it simply because I think as a home rule issue, it's a reasonable one for us to manage at this level so we have a much better feel for whether it is or is not going into uncomfortable areas.
All right. So I put myself in the queue, and then after me is Betty, Alan, and the mayor. So I agree with a lot of what Chris just said. I don't know that I would support inclusionary zoning for Eugene. I think we haven't been able to have the debate because we've been stifled from having the debate because the state has precluded us from even considering it as an option. So I think it's, Mike might be correct that they don't take any action on this and nothing changes, but I would like us to have the ability to have that debate locally. And I think it's taken away, we talk a lot about the tools we have to get things done, and it's taken away a tool that we might want to use. We might not want to use it, but right now we don't even have the option. So I will support Councilor Taylor motion because I think we should be able to have that debate at the local level and decide whether or not this kind of zoning is appropriate for Eugene or not. Councilor Taylor.
Thank you. I really wanted to point out what you two people have just done, that we're not really discussing whether we should have inclusionary zoning. This is not the time for that. What we're discussing is whether we should be banned from deciding it even. And I did want to remark about Boston, though. I was there in 2000. I had an early morning freezing walk with the mayor, Mayor Menino, and he was very proud of the inclusionary zoning, which was in downtown Boston at that time. But that's really off the topic right now. What we're talking about is whether the state should prohibit us from considering it. Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, does the legislation that we're talking about actually require inclusionary zoning?
No.
Doesn't. I didn't think it did when I glanced over it. So this is just it just allows us the ability to have a conversation about whether or not we would want a local level to be able to do this. And I agree with Councilor Pryor. This is a home rule issue. I think that discussion should be at the local level. And I'm not exactly sure how this is very different from what we did in MUPD, which is we required basically workforce level housing in a MUPD building in order to get the MUPD. While it's not exactly the same, it's a little apples and oranges, but the principle's pretty darn much the same. So I can't see, if you agreed with that this would be so objectionable. So I'm willing to have that conversation. So a yes vote for this means that we want to discuss it, not necessarily that we're going to do it. I may or may not, when we get into the nuts and bolts of it, because we haven't really had any discussion because it's been prohibited for so long, that I may or may not want to do that, and might be some certain circumstances where it seems appropriate. But I too care about affordable housing and price of housing too, and if it's and what kind of housing that we have. So all those factors go into that conversation when we have it. But without this, we can't even have that conversation. So I'm inclined to support the motion.
Mayor Piercy.
Yeah, I just want to agree with a lot of what I've heard. First of all, this is not saying we're going to have inclusionary zoning. It just takes away the prohibition, a deal that was made for other purposes some time ago. And the history of Eugene has been that we've always supported getting rid of that ban so that we could have that as an option. I went to a recent housing conference in Oakland, and in some cases they really spoke strongly about why this was an important tool to have at the table. I think if we should ever choose to use it, it would be how and when and where, but I think we should be able to have that discussion. So I certainly appreciate the motion being put out there. I appreciate joining with the city of Portland in creating that local option for communities to try to build their affordable housing stock. Our affordable housing stock is really not being able to keep up with what we need it to be. So we really have to think carefully, is there a way that this tool can help us? And maybe we do it differently than we've historically seen, but we should actually take a look at it. Thanks.
All right, Councilor Brown, and then maybe we'll be ready for a vote.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Yeah, what this motion does is it would, the city of Eugene would lobby Salem to overturn the inclusionary zoning. This doesn't mean that we or any other city would immediately start working on an inclusionary zoning ordinance. I agree with some of the other councilors that we should have that discussion. I think it shows a lot of potential, and it's true there might be some places where it didn't work so good, but I believe that there are many places where it did, and I think we should examine it at some point in the future. By the way, it's not just for us. It would overturn it in the ban in the whole state, and that would allow communities like Ontario and Burns and Klamath Falls and anywhere you can name, Newport, Florence, to perhaps use this as a way to diversify their housing situation. So we're not really saying that we're going to immediately start working on inclusionary zoning in Eugene. It's merely to overturn the ban at the state level so that all the communities can have this conversation and move forward solutions to their housing problems. Thanks.
All right. So, Councilor Taylor, you want to restate your motion and we'll vote?
Okay, it's pretty short. I move that the city support legislation to repeal the statutory prohibition on inclusionary zoning.
All those in favor, please raise your hand. And opposed? 6-2. Motion passes. And Councilor Taylor, you have a second motion.
Yes. I move that the city actively lobby for legislation that requires all private employers in the state to provide paid sick leave benefits that equal or are better than those required by Eugene's sick leave ordinance.
Second.
Moved and seconded. I have Councilor Clark in the queue, but Betty, if you want to speak to your motion before I call on Councilor Clark.
I don't think there's much to say about it. We did discuss this when we passed the sick leave ordinance, and it's just a matter of saying that we'd like this to be true for everyone in the state. And I know at the time we passed ours, some people said we should wait for the state, but at this time, the state will be discussing it, and this says that we will lobby to encourage them.
All right. I have Mike, Alan, George Brown, Chris, and George Poling.
We got a second. We did.
You did, George.
Yeah.
George, second.
Yeah.
I move to amend. I saw earlier a last-minute email from Councilor Zelenka that was in agreement with a motion that I made during the initial part of this conversation. And so I thought, as long as we're doing this, let's wrap it all up and finish it all at once. So I move to amend to direct the city manager to delay the implementation of the Eugene sick leave ordinance to October 1st from July 1st, as we want to wait and see what the legislature actually does so as not to overburden local businesses.
I'll second.
I'll speak to that if I may.
Sure.
The piece that this is again a motion that I made initially because we don't know how this is going to come out. Now we're saying that we would like to have the legislature match our legislation or better in terms of the elements of it and how it works. And that's fine, but I think we should be fair to area businesses and to folks that have to implement this and wait until we see what the full landscape looks like before requiring them to comply. Thank you.
So, Councilor Clark, I just want to clarify, is your motion to request that the city manager bring back an ordinance that would delay for a public hearing to delay implementation?
Would that be required in order to do that at this point? So yes, then that is the correct form of the motion that I intended.
Okay. I've got Alan. I've got you, George.
Thank you.
I agree with the initial motion. I don't agree with the second one because that's not what my email said. My email said that we would delay implementation to October 1st contingent upon the state acting to enact a statewide sick leave ordinance. So it's a pretty big difference. It's not just a blanket push out 3 months. It's only if they act. If they don't act, then ours goes, and there is no law, there's no reason to delay implementation, then ours would go into effect, and the administrative laws or administrative rules are already finalized, would go into effect as planned July 1, and this would say only if the legislature acted would we delay our implementation. So can I move to amend the amendment?
Can amend an amendment.
I can move to substitute.
Yes.
I move to substitute to direct the city manager to schedule a public hearing on the ordinance that would change the sick leave ordinance implementation date from July 1, 2015 to October 1, 2015, contingent on the legislature enacting paid sick leave legislation similar to Eugene's.
So I'm going to correct. I'm sorry, the motion to substitute, we need to vote on the amendment
The amendment to the motion,
first, correct?
or any substitutions can be made.
Yes,
That's not a substitute, then it's just a regular
Yeah.
amendment.
right.
So we have to debate this amendment first and vote on that before any other motions can be put out.
Correct.
I still have four.
So stand by,
So,
Alan.
so it does appear that the legislature may indeed pass a statewide paid sick leave law, and it may look very similar to ours in our ordinance, but as we know, it's not really a safe bet to predict the outcome of any piece of legislation, much less the specific content. So why I believe that statewide law is a good idea, and said that earlier, and it'll probably look very much like ours. So I think it would be prudent on our part to make sure that our local businesses, there's not a conflict between what the state does and what we do. If they come up with a law and it has some minor changes to it that are pretty easily implementable, and it takes just a little bit of delay, like 3 months, to be able to get the local businesses to not have to implement two different sets of rules and making them the same, then that would allow us to amend our administrative rules and potentially our ordinance if we needed to make them both be the same and allow them to go into effect. Ours to go into effect October 1 if they act. If they don't act, then July 1. And my expectation is that the state law wouldn't go into effect October 1. It would probably go into effect probably at the earliest January 1, if not later than that. So ours would go into effect earlier, but it does make sense to have them true up so that they're similar, because we would be preempted anyway.
So I'm continuing with the queue I had with Councilor Taylor's motion, and if you don't want to be in that queue, you can let me know. George Brown.
Well, are we discussing the amendment proposed by Councilor
Yes.
Clark? Yeah. I think that we should go ahead with our plan and not, we don't, the state, I'm sure, will take this up, but we have no idea if they're going to pass any significant legislation or not, and I think we should go ahead with ours. If they do, in fact, pass, then we will go in compliance with theirs. I think we should just go ahead with our plans for July 1st. And so I won't support the amendment. I will support the original motion. Thanks.
Then I had Chris.
Thank you. The challenge for me is we're just kind of talking about two different things. And that it would be better for me, I would be more comfortable if I voted on each thing separately, since they're two different ideas. For that reason, I won't support an amendment, because it's putting the two things together. If we wanted to break it out separately as a separate thing, I think that's a great way to do it, and I would probably be supportive of that, because I think it's a good idea to true things up and have them be consistent. I think a delay to see what the legislature is doing is a good idea, but I don't want to tack it on to another piece. So I'll oppose it as an amendment, but I would probably support it as its own freestanding delay, because I think we probably do need to make sure things true up. With regard to the motion itself, I will support it, because I think the state is where it should have been all along. In fact, I've already been lobbying my local legislators to support it at the statewide level, because that is where I thought it should have been. So yeah, I can absolutely support the first one, but I'm challenged to support it with that additional piece in, because I just like to talk about it separately. I'll probably support it as well, but I'd prefer to do it as a separate motion.
All right. Councilor Pulling.
Yeah, am going to support the amendment. I can't see the logic behind us implementing something July 1st if the state comes out with an ordinance that doesn't go into effect until, say, January 1st. That's actually ends up being equal to or better than ours, and if there's some changes in it that, I mean, it's just going to be a waste of time for people to try to implement ours and then turn around and implement the state's if the state does pass one. So I will support the amendment because I think it's necessary to have it attached to the motion so that we know that this is what we're doing and that the people know that, you know, we're going to go ahead and lobby for a statewide, but in the meantime, we're going to put ours on hold until the state gets done.
Greg.
Thanks, Council President. I agree with Alan's suggested motion and his clarification of what his intentions are. I think the best way for us to move forward is to understand that if the state does pass this, that we are able to have a buffer, the 3-month buffer, if you will, if we're to be able to, see what syncs up between our local ordinance and what the state passes, if the state passes anything. And I also want to note that this is actually becoming a national trend. President Obama has talked about paid sick leave, and I believe that he is going to be implementing an executive order to that effect for the federal workers. So if we're moving in that direction and things are moving in gaining that kind of momentum, and I'm hearing that's happening around the country, I don't see any harm in us, being able to, look and see what the state does or doesn't do, and having a 3-month delay in implementing our legislation, I don't think is going to, make a huge amount of difference in that context. So, I won't support the amendment to the motion, but I will support another amendment that may come forward from passage of the initial motion when we get back to discussing that.
All right. I put myself in the queue, but before I make my own comments, originally before the 5:30 work session, I had indicated to Councilor Zelenka he had sent his motion in via email at 5 o'clock today, and I said maybe we could take it up after our public hearings and work this evening. So there could still be an opportunity to, if this amendment doesn't carry, to consider a similar motion later this evening. I'm feeling the same way as Chris. I might support Councillor Clark's motion with the contingency that the state legislature actually act, but I'd like it to be separate from this other statement that Councillor Taylor had put out. So I think there are two different issues. So I will be voting against the amendment. And Mike, you're back in the queue, and then Betty.
Thank you. Two things are important to remember about my amendment. Number one, I would say that while the legislature has some obligation to be done near or at that time frame so that we will know, we can't certainly know for a fact on July 1st that the legislature will be done. I mean, they have the option when they meet to set their own rules, and they have the ability to meet beyond there. So there isn't a certain knowledge that they will be done and have made a decision on this question prior to July 1st. And because that's true, I'll accept as a friendly the contingency language so that it alters my amendment to say contingent upon them having dealt with that, passed that or not. I'll accept that to my motion as a friendly. The second then would be...
Does your second accept?
The second piece that's important is that all my amendment does is ask the manager to come back with clarifying language in an ordinance so we can have the discussion again. No one is passing that today. We're asking the manager to come back with more information, which we tend to always to support. Thank you.
Betty.
I don't think we should delay at all. We've delayed long enough already. I mean, July 1st is quite a while from the time we started discussing this, and it won't make any difference except to the people who get sick in the meantime, and whose children get sick. And people do get sick in the summertime as well as in the wintertime. And I think that it's important to stick to our July 1st date. So I will vote against the amendment.
Mayor Piercy, did you want to get in the queue?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay. And Chris?
If what you're doing is making an amendment that more or less brings your amendment in line with what Alan was proposing, and I'm just now seeing it for the first time.
Which was the heart of my original motion.
Yeah, and I needed to have that. I need to understand that. So if I understand correctly, what you're doing is you're making your amendment align with what Alan was talking about.
What he wrote down.
What he wrote down, which I'll read to you because I've seen it for the first time myself. Move to direct the city manager to schedule a public hearing on an ordinance that would change the sick leave ordinance implementation date from July 1, 2015 to October 1st, 2015, contingent on the legislature enacting paid sick leave legislation similar to Eugene's. Is that kind of what your intention is?
Before that date, yes.
Okay. So
The added language I would put there to make that contingency work.
with this in place, because I do support delaying until we know what the legislature is going to do, and I like the contingency aspect to it. So if that is indeed your amendment, if it follows this format, then I can support that. I think that's okay.
And before I call on Alan, just to clarify the way this amendment is constructed, it doesn't replace Councilor Taylor's motion. It adds this
on.
additional
Well,
piece to it.
that's one of the questions. So it's not a substitute, it's an attack.
It's an amendment.
So we would still be actively lobbying
Correct.
So you
for
just,
Eugene or better and
right.
scheduling a public hearing.
Right, so just, add the word and then what Counselor Pryor just read.
Councilor Zelinka.
So I'm persuaded that these two should be two separate motions, so I'd like to be in the queue after we vote on this, but, so I will move to table the amendment.
Second.
Okay. A motion to table is not debatable,
Correct.
and so we will, and
Point of order, does that affect the original motion?
I think the whole conversation is tabled.
It just puts the motion I made on the table until such a time as this is finished, and then it brings the motion I made back on the table.
But it affects the original motion since it's all linked together now.
No.
Oh, okay.
Debating. You're debating.
Can you,
Yeah, we are debating. It's, right now, all we're doing is putting the motion, it's to table the amendment. That was.
so what happens to the original motion?
Still on the table.
Still on the table, and you're going to
Back
vote
to
on
it.
it.
Okay.
Back to the original motion.
So we have to vote on the motion to table.
Point of order.
Not its amendment.
Yes, Mike?
You can, I wasn't aware you could table an amendment
And still
On-
pass the main motion.
and still pass the main motion. Doesn't it link the
hasn't been
two that you
passed.
can't
I'm
pass
looking at
this-
my chart.
She's checking.
You can't pass the main motion until you've disposed of the amendment?
Since an amendment.
Yeah, because after you pass the motion, the amendment becomes moot.
Oh, my gosh. Give me 1 second.
Sure. We are pausing for Robert's Rules of Order
Robert
clarification.
Rule,
And I just want to remind us all, we do have an important presentation
But you
on
have
our
to
consolidated
dispose of an
plan that
amendment
we
before you can dispose
want to take
of a
up
motion.
in this hour. It's not going to tell us.
It's not going to tell us.
Check this app.
check the app. There you go. That would be more current anyway.
It makes,
When
no,
was-
it makes no, it puts the whole thing on it tables the entire thing.
Tables the
You can't
entire thing.
table just the amendment or it wouldn't actually work. So it tables the entire,
It's got to.
Yeah.
The
It has
amendment
to.
hasn't been passed yet. You could table it, can't you? We didn't
No.
pass the amendment.
Not without tabling the motion.
You haven't passed
The
the
original motion
Right.
gets tabled too.
the entire thing is tabled.
Yes.
Right, then I withdraw my
You don't-
motion.
you withdraw it?
table,
Okay.
But I will vote against this, so it can be two separate motions.
Okay.
Okay.
So anyone else before we vote on the motion as amended?
Not amended.
Just not the
We're voting
On the amendment.
On the amendment.
Voting
yeah.
on the amendment.
Voting on
Are you
the,
voting on the tabling?
no,
No, Alan withdrew his motion to table because
Okay.
it didn't accomplish what he'd
But-
hoped.
it tables the
Okay.
main
But-
motion.
He'll bring it back.
So we are now voting on the amendment to Councilor Taylor's motion. So all those in favor of Councilor Clark's amendment, please raise your hand. And we've got 2 and opposed.
If you're going to bring it back, I can put
I will move to have it back.
6.
If you will put me in the queue, please, for after Counselor Taylor.
So the original motion is back on the table, and I don't have anyone in the queue.
I asked to be in the queue
Oh.
when I was speaking earlier.
Oh, for the love of God.
You want to be in the queue for Counselor Taylor's motion?
It's a battle of who gets to make the motion first.
Well, it's who did.
Alan.
And for me, it was months ago.
Well, we're going to vote on this?
Now we're voting.
We're ready to vote, but you said you want to be in the queue.
Yeah, I wanted to be
Oh,
in the
after
queue
the vote.
after we
I
vote
see.
on the motion.
Which is what I
All right,
asked you.
all those in favor of Counselor Taylor's original motion, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and opposed, 2. Counselor Taylor motion passes.
And
We have to take up right now? We can't wait till,
Be pretty quick, I think.
all right, Alan.
So I would move to direct the city manager to schedule public hearing on the ordinance that would change the sick leave ordinance's implementation date from July 1, 2015 to October 1, 2015, contingent on the legislature enacting paid sick leave similar to Eugene's.
Is there a second?
Second.
Chris seconds. All right, now we have a queue for Alan's motion. But Alan, I'll let you speak to it first, and then George, you're in the queue.
Yeah, I kind of already did in that I think they're going to be similar if they pass, but I think it behooves us to be cognizant of the fact that it may be right up against the time that we're going to implement them, and changes may need to be made to true up our 2 ordinances, and adding 3 months doesn't really hurt if they enact something. Doesn't really hurt that much. We've been waiting for this a long time, but it allows businesses to then make sure that they're only implementing 1 set of rules instead of potentially 2 sets of rules. So having that true-up period, I think, is a smart thing to do, and it allows the businesses to make those adjustments should the legislature pass a statewide law.
Counselor Brown.
I have a question. Your motion said something about
no, I don't want
having a public hearing
to say anything productive.
contingent on what the legislature does, or have the public hearing to
No.
specify that it would go into effect no later than October 1st, depending on what the legislature does?
To clarify, it would require a public hearing to change the implementation date because it's set in ordinance.
I see.
And so what this does is it moves that out only if the legislature acts. So it'd be if the legislature acted before July 1, then it would automatically move the implementation date out to October 1 instead of July 1.
But we'd hold the public hearing on that.
But this
question.
isn't voting on that measure. It's bringing
This
back
will come back.
a motion to have a public hearing to then have input on that, and then we would implement that actual ordinance.
All right, thank you for that clarification. I don't think I'll support this. We say, well, what's 3 months? What 3 months for the 22,000, the 25,000 workers that don't have the ability to earn sick pay is, I think it's very important for them, and I do believe that any delay will be detrimental. I also think that by us having our policy firmly in place will be a great stimulus to the legislature to actually go ahead and pass legislation granting the ability to earn sick leave. And I don't see it. I just don't want to see any delay, so I don't think I will support this motion.
Actually, well,
Counselor Polling.
Thank you. It would have been nice if I was able to get a copy of of Alan's motion, because to me, the discussion around the table sounds like the same thing that Mike just put out, which sounds like the same thing Mike tried to do when we were talking about the ordinance in the first place, is to delay the implementation. I guess I will support the motion that Alan's put out, but to me, it makes no sense why we're doing it this way when it's the same basic language that we had when we passed the ordinance just a few minutes ago.
Mike.
Thank you. This is what gives politics a bad name right here, and I just want to say that I appreciate, however, my colleague finally coming around to support the motion that I made a few months ago.
Greg.
I have a question on this. So if the state passes a similar bill, before July 1, and that bill is almost identical to, say, our ordinance, could we move up the implementation date from October 1 to, say, when we come back into session from council from our break in September? Would this preclude us from doing that and, accelerating us, moving up if we've got, state law that is practically identical to what we're trying to do locally?
City Attorney, do you have a,
Depends on timing.
would we have to reopen it to change the date again?
It's going to depend on how we can craft the contingency language. That's one of the things we're going to need to work on to bring back to you. So we'll have to, if this motion passes, then we will craft language for the public hearing to consider, and we'll work through that with the contingency language.
So, for instance, so if it does line up that it's pretty much the same thing, then possibly we could just move forward on July 1 without having the delay. That's kind of where I'm getting to. If the state is, spot on with a few tweaks and, things of that nature, would we be able to implement July 1 as we originally intended, or would we just go ahead and, wait until October 1st?
Two rules.
It's a future debate.
Well, and that's not consistent actually with the motion that you just made,
Well,
what you described.
Yeah, I'm just asking the question because I'm conceivably see that could be a possibility. Not that it would be a probability, but a possibility that, basically they take our legislation and say, this is good for the state, let's do this.
Can I clarify my intent?
I'll call on you in a second, Alan. Anything else, Greg?
No, that's it. I'm just
Alan?
being devil's advocate,
Yeah, to
okay?
clarify my intent, it was to allow, when I wrote this motion earlier and submitted it to council for an intended motion earlier, granted, kind of 11th hour, but the intent was if there's a difference that we would need that true-up period. If there's really no difference, then there's really no need for the true-up. So my intent is to allow for the implementation date to go into effect should there be a need for businesses to be able to, and us potentially, to change our ordinance so that it complies with what the state law said. So for instance, if let's say our law says 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, if the state law ends up being 1 hour for every 32, pretty easy to do, but if they pass that on July 30th, businesses may need a little time to react to that and and we need to change our administrative rules or our ordinance to comply with theirs, so that would take some time. But if it's essentially the same, I wouldn't think that there would need to be a delay if there's no real differences between what the state enact and what we have already put into law in Eugene.
Betty, and then I'm hoping we can vote.
I don't think the state can preempt something we've already done, can they? If we've
Yes.
already passed it?
Absolutely, they can.
Yeah,
Do it all the time.
that's why they're the state.
We exist in a
They can stop us from doing it before we do it, but I didn't think they could preempt it after.
They can.
Okay, well, I still think we should stick with the way we voted for it. And whatever we do right now, we won't change it, right? We would have a public hearing
Correct.
before we change it. But I will vote against this. I think July 1st is a good date, best we can do. Thanks.
Okay. All right, we will vote on Councilor Zelenka's motion. All those in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and opposed? 2. Motion carries. Thank you. So now we will move on to a shortened version of a presentation and work session on our Eugene Springfield 2015 Consolidated Plan by Mayor Piercy. Stephanie Jennings is here to present that to us, and I just wanted to note that on Friday, Stephanie was the recipient of a special recognition from the Lane Council of Governments for her exemplary work on the Lane Livability Consortium project, and so I just wanted to congratulate you again and thank you for your wonderful work on that important project.
Thank you, Councilor Surratt. So I'm here tonight to talk about the consolidated plan. Many of you may remember that I came back in November. Sorry.
That
thank
mic
you.
forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speak right into the microphone. I came back in November to talk with you about the consolidated plan. This is an update presentation and an opportunity to hear your feedback on the directions that we're heading with this. We're not asking for any actions this evening, but we'll be coming back again in April for further discussion and action. We do have a presentation that I'll try to move through fairly quickly just to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. And really just wanted to quickly just recap the process for developing the consolidated plan. We did talk about this in November. The consolidated plan is a federal document created for the purpose of receiving CDBG and home funds in the communities. Sorry. Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you for the reminder. So as we look at the purpose of this, it is needs and strategies for the use of home and CDBG funds in Eugene and Springfield over a 5-year period. There are several stated purposes related to the plan. Really, you're looking largely at community trends and issues, and then you're trying to prioritize what you would like to use the CDBG and home funds for over the next 5 years. It is a framework. It's not a specific plan of action. We supplement the consolidated plan each year with a 1-year action plan that council also takes action on. So I think it's important to keep in mind that this is high level. As we look at the two main programs that are funded through HUD, they are the Community Development Block Grant and the Home Investment Partnership Program. They have limited uses, and so they are not incredibly flexible resources for our community, and so part of this process that we go through will identify needs that won't necessarily fit with the home and CDBG funds that we receive. Home is specifically focused on creation of permanent and transitional affordable housing, while CDBG has a broader range of uses, including human services, economic opportunities, improvement to low-income neighborhoods. I think the big picture is that the funding has gone down precipitously in the past decade, and this funding drop, I think, is exacerbated by inflation and the cost of goods and services that make the impact of this drop even greater than the 33% shown on this slide. This roughly outlines the stages of the process that we're moving through. We have completed our assessment of past activities. We're currently gathering, mostly completed with our data analysis and market conditions. We're moving into the process of setting priorities, and so that's really where we're looking for your feedback this evening. And as you look at the timeline, you can see that this is a fairly rapid planning process. And so we need to submit our plan to HUD by May 15th. And so we'll be coming back and requesting action by council on April 22nd. As I said before, We supplement the consolidated plan with one-year action plans, and so we have an opportunity to revisit goals, strategies, work each year. So this is certainly by no means the only opportunity that council will have to weigh in on this work as we move through the next consolidated planning period. Consolidated plan includes two strategic plans. The first is the affordable housing strategies. This, in the past 5-year period, was supported with both CDBG and home funds. As you can see, the two main areas are increasing the supply of affordable housing and rehabilitating existing housing. We did, for a variety of reasons, fall short of the goal of 500 units. The loss of funding did play into that significantly, and I'll go over a couple of other factors in a moment. And just a note about the rehabilitation of existing housing. Those unit rehabs include a very large number of emergency home repairs that we do each year to keep people at risk of homelessness from becoming homeless. Other outcomes, we don't anticipate that we will be able to acquire any land bank sites by the end of the period, but that is something that we are actively pursuing and hope to have some opportunities there in the near future. And then for homeownership, this was an area that was also a casualty of the reduction in funding. We are exploring some options for supporting this in the future. And then lastly is the policy aspect of continuing to look at ways to reduce barriers to affordable housing. These are the 6 major projects that were completed using home and CDBG funds. As you look at these developments, all of them were targeted to very low-income households earning 60% of AMI and below. Many earned much lower than that. Almost half were targeted to specific populations, including ex-offenders, persons with developmental disabilities, persons with mental illness, and veterans. This is a use of funds that leverages a tremendous amount of resources for our community from external sources. And so you can see $4 million leveraging over $36 million in state, federal, and private investments. It's important to note that we combine the federal funds with our local subsidies that we currently have available to us, which include the system development charge waiver and the low-income housing property tax exemption. The second set of strategies are the Community Development Strategic Plan. This is supported just with community development block grant money. In the past period, we had 4 major goal areas: supporting human service operations and capital improvements. We met our human service operation goal, fell a little bit short on the capital improvements, again, caused by the decrease in CDBG funding available. The business loan program, the city has a revolving business development fund funded with CDBG that's largely self-supporting. The goal of job creation was exceeded, and then as well as the goal of supporting microenterprises was also exceeded. The 2 other areas are accessibility and strategic improvements to low-income neighborhoods, and both of those goals were met in the past period. I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail for the 2 major programs supported. The nonprofit capital facility projects, you can see examples here of the various facilities that have been supported through the nonprofit capital facilities programs. And also recent business development fund loans. All of these were able to be supported with CDBG because they created jobs available to low-income people in the community. I'm going to move through this part fairly quickly and just hit the high-level points. Really, as we talk about what we want to do moving forward, understanding what's happening in our community is a critical piece of this picture. We do, on the demographic side, see the most significant changes in our Latino population, and also we have a growing number of seniors in our community. As we look at conditions of economic vulnerability, we looked at a variety of factors, and we still see quite a bit, and also some of these factors are worsening, particularly children and youth eligible for free or reduced price lunches is one indicator of child poverty in our community. And we also know that there's an even greater percentage of households that, should they lose their income, they do not have enough savings to really subsist at poverty level for very long. We do know that there are some geographic variations to need in our community, and so we have definitely identified areas along Highway 99 and West 11th. As some of those areas, we did create an economic vulnerability index through the Lane Livability Consortium Equity and Opportunity Assessment, and so that included the 4 factors you see here. As you look at this map, really the areas that are darkest are the ones where we have the greatest incidence of multiple indicators of economic vulnerability. So this map, of course, includes both Eugene and Springfield, the entire planning area. So the West Eugene area and Central Eugene are of particular focus. Looking at wages and employment, many of you are familiar with some of these statistics. We know that job market instability was caused by reductions in multiple sectors. We have lost many jobs. We've only gained some of them back, and our wages continue to fall short of the state average. As we look at housing need in our community, I really think of it in terms of these 4 dimensions of affordability, availability, quality, and location. Typically, if you have all of these things, that's going to be your highest cost housing in the community. As we think about housing problems in our community, and you think about each of these factors, you can pull out some helpful information. Really, we do have a continuing housing affordability issue where there is a mismatch between wages and rents. We also have a housing quality challenge in our community, as much of the units were constructed before 1980. We also have a significant number of manufactured home units, and continued low rental vacancy rates. And many of people benefit when they're in good locations, but those locations tend to carry a premium. So taking all of this information into account, as well as many consultations that we have conducted with agencies and community members, we are really proposing to focus on 3 major areas moving forward: housing opportunity, human services, and economic opportunity. You can see the specific bullet points, and you can see how it reflects some of what we have done in the past. I think by focusing in these areas, we will make better use of our limited resources and hopefully get to greater impacts. We're also interested in finding ways to leverage and augment the existing resources and explore new partnerships and how to leverage these existing resources. So I think I will stop here. Just briefly go through the next steps. We will continue to gather community input. We have formed a consolidated plan advisory committee. So as in the past, as we've moved through these processes, we had Eugene Community Development Advisory Committee, the Intergovernmental Housing Policy Board, and then Springfield had their own Community Development Advisory Committee. We're essentially taking representatives from those 3 committees and pulling them together for a series of 3 meetings. that will include a public hearing. We will work with them to refine and finalize the priority needs and strategies that we'll be bringing back to council in April. At the same time, we will work with our CDBG Advisory Committee and Housing Policy Board to establish the recommendations for the one-year action plan. The unfortunate thing about this process is you don't get any break to kind of do your big picture planning. You have to continue to fly the airplane that you're flying while you're building and designing another one on the ground, and you have to have another one taking off. So, with all of those different factors, we will be bringing back both the consolidated plan and the one-year action plan back to council for your consideration on April 22nd.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Who would like to be in the queue? Well, while you're gathering your thoughts, I will make a couple of comments and ask a question. It seems like really great work in terms of the draft strategies that you've already scoped out. In terms of my knowledge of what our needs are and what our challenges are, this, in my mind, gets at a lot of those issues. And you could tell by our conversation prior to you coming to the table, this council is thinking about affordable housing and how we create more stock for people to have access to in our community. So I think it's in line with what we're hearing from council as a whole as well. Just a question on the data that you presented. Is county-wide data, since this is Eugene Springfield Consolidated Plan?
Where possible, we try to use data for the metro area because there are such significant differences in the county as a whole. Sometimes we only have access to county-wide data, but where possible, we do try to focus on the metro area.
So I was just curious, the 5% of manufactured homes, that includes Eugene and Springfield?
Correct.
Okay, correct. That was the kind of clarification I was looking for. Is there anywhere in these strategies the use of the land bank concept? Is that still there to be looking for land bank property? And how does that effort relate to our dispersal policy around dispersing affordable housing projects throughout the city or social services throughout the city?
Any land bank site purchase would be subject to the housing dispersal policy, and so typically, and the city hasn't acquired a land bank site for almost 10 years, and so typically what happens is the city council would allocate CDBG funds for the purpose of land banking, and then we would go through a process where we're identifying a site, working with the neighborhood, and also vetting the site according to housing dispersal and other criteria. And then we would come back to City Council for a decision on whether or not to purchase the site.
So is the authorization to use the funds done with a potential site in mind, or is it done more as a concept and then you go out and look for a potential site?
Well, typically, CDBG has strict expenditure deadlines, and so we try to make sure that we are likely to be able to acquire a site in the near future. You don't have to have a specific site in mind, but we're always trying to keep track of those expenditure deadlines. And so you don't want to ever dedicate CDBG funds to a use that you don't anticipate would be happening in the relatively near future.
Thank you. Chris.
Great, thanks. And I see.
Thank you.
I serve on the Housing Policy Board, and this is a critical time, actually, and very serendipitous that this plan is actually right now needing to be updated because it's a great opportunity for us. There's actually a whole number of opportunities, not the least of which is the economic development opportunity through these kinds of housing options, because most people recognize that good economic stability and good financial stability requires two really major components. One is housing and one is jobs. You really need the two, and they really do go together. Whether you have to have the housing before you can get the good job or you have to have the good job to get the housing is debatable, but you need to have both. The ability to provide both working level, but also affordable housing, I think, is critically important for the success of our economic development efforts. I think good planning when we're in an era of reduced resources is even more critical. As you can see from the charts, the money from the federal government is declining dramatically. I mean, that's the only word you can use, the dramatic decline. What we were able to fund before, what we were able to support before, we can't. And so we have to really be smart, and these consolidated plans are the way we can act much more intelligently and thoughtfully, not just as a local jurisdiction, but also as a region, which really leads to another point. Eugene and Springfield have been working together very successfully for a number of years. The Housing Policy Board has functioned very effectively as a group that not only deals with the specific needs and interests of Eugene, but also the needs and interests of Springfield. And we want to maintain that even in this period of reduced funding and reduced resources. And so this is also providing an opportunity to kind of reinvent that relationship in a way that will be even more effective in the light of reduced resources. So many things are all converging right now at this very moment. And I think they're things that could, on the surface, appear to be very challenging for us. But if you dig a little bit beneath that surface and you assume that we're all going to be very smart about this, there are beneath that some real opportunities for us to create some initiatives around economic development, around housing, around jobs, around relationships that could work really to our advantage even as we try to leverage more funds. So I fully applaud this effort, and I think it's coming right at the perfect time.
Councilor Brown?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple questions. The pages aren't numbered, but the first one, it's assess past activities. The 2010 Affordable Housing Strategies, and it says acquire land bank sites. The planned outcome was 2 sites. The estimated outcome is 0. We're just wondering what the status of the Naval Reserve, the old Naval Reserve Center on 11th near Chambers is. My understanding is that's kind of earmarked for some kind of an affordable housing project.
My understanding is that the city owns that site.
Yeah.
There are 2 kind of connected issues. One is the zoning. It's currently zoned as public land. And then the second is I am not aware of any action City Council has taken to designate that site for future affordable housing development.
I see. What would it take to make that happen? It seems like a good site, and I know the neighborhood is, I know the Jefferson West Side neighbors are supportive of the idea of affordable housing there.
We talked about it being part of the redesignation package. You might remember the Jefferson West Side neighborhood asked that we go through a process before we redesignated that wasn't lining up with the Envision Eugene package. So we pulled it out and said we would come back to that post-adoption of Envision Eugene. So it's a future discussion for us to have.
I see. Okay. And then and these targets, this was for the 5-year, these were for the 5-year targets for the whole plan. And then my other question was a couple pages further, it says $4 million in home and CDBG funds leveraged over $36 million in state, federal, and private investments. Is that over the 5-year period?
Yes.
Okay. So all of these are, and then the objectives of jobs created and trainees, that was for 5 years. Okay.
All over the 5-year period.
All right, great. Thank you.
Betty?
Thank you. Did you discuss the possibility of using some of these funds for single occupancy rooms?
All of these funds, so generally the way that our funding works is that we put the money out in a request for proposals, and we have many capable providers in the community that come back. And we have received many and funded many proposals over time for single room occupancy developments. So at this point in time, really there's that is allowed in our processes. And so examples of a couple of developments that were supported in this past 5-year period that I think most people would call single room occupancy include Roosevelt Crossing at Highway 99, which was developed by sponsors and HACSA. And then also what's called Bothy Cottage, which is a group home for female ex-offenders with children that is also run by sponsors.
But just for people who can't afford an apartment or a house, it seems to me there's a great need for a place where people could rent a room. And this is not something that's being planned, you're saying?
Well, at this point,
Not any particular group, just people who can't afford
Yep.
something else.
We can certainly fund general single-room occupancy as long as it meets the affordability requirements that come along with the use of the federal funds. It doesn't have to be designated for a particular population. So that's certainly something that we could prioritize in the future.
I think many of the people who are on the streets now could maybe afford a room, but they can't afford anything else. So I would like us to try to find a way to do that, to have a building with single rooms. Bath down the hall. Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, this is definitely just, this whole program is great work so far. The pictures of the projects that you put up there are all really great projects and really good outcomes that we've seen so far. Doesn't quite go far enough for me, but most of them I recognize and have seen and thought they were great projects. It's nice to see them all kind of put in one place. And as Chris said, this is incredibly important right now. I mean, jobs and housing go together, and the Bush recession lost 16,000 jobs, and we've only got 5,400 back. We're still way behind, and there's, as you rightly pointed out in a lot of these slides, there's a number of people that are economically very vulnerable, and 19% of our fellow citizens live in poverty, and housing is particularly difficult for them to secure. And so that makes this plan even more important. Question I had is related to the sources of funding. You didn't have a slide on that. Maybe you can talk about that in terms of how much is the total and percentage that are federal, state, and local, and emphasis on where we get our local monies for these programs.
So we expect over the next 5 years to receive about $13 million in home and CDBG funds between both Eugene and Springfield, and the amount that comes from other sources is really determined on a case-by-case basis. Typically what happens with affordable housing developments is we issue an RFP, we work with providers to submit proposals, we then dedicate or tentatively allocate local resources, and in many cases they then go on and request resources through the state's NOFA process. For the larger affordable housing developments, the leverage can be very significant, sometimes in the range of 10 to 1. For smaller special needs projects, we're doing more of the funding locally for those projects. So there's no set percentages in terms of how much we will be able to leverage for those resources. We do, the only other sort of main sources of local funding, if you will, are the System Development Charge Grant Program, which primarily benefits new construction, and then the Low-Income Housing Property Tax Exemption. And so in most cases, we're combining our local resources with these federal funds that we receive, and then they're going to other sources to fill in the remaining gaps, or getting equity investments, or getting permanent lending to fill out their budgets.
So much local City of Eugene money goes into this?
Aside from the...
Not including the CDBGs and all the other federal and state monies and tax credits.
So there's, because it's system development charge, there is sort of a certain amount that's available, but it's not really a budgeted amount because it's based on the amount of SDCs that are needed. And then for the tax exemption, it's also on a case-by-case basis, so there's really not any money that's actively budgeted to support affordable housing
Yeah, I never see the
development.
line item in
Right.
our budget.
Right.
So with the part that's SDC, so that means that one of these projects comes up for development, and there's SDT charges that need to be paid in order for it to move forward and get its permits. There's an ability to use SDC money to pay those for these different projects. Is that what's happened on some of these larger projects?
Yes. Yes, and it's the local SDCs only. The city doesn't have the ability to exempt them from the regional SDC charges.
Regional meaning like MWMC and
Yes.
wastewater?
Yes.
Okay. So that amount isn't really that great, but it's significant when you're trying to put together a project.
Yes.
It can make difference between moving forward and not moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, these are important resources in terms of making these projects. Both were enacted by council. They're codified, and so we do follow the guidelines and code as we're implementing these. And so, council will, for example, with system development charge waivers, authority lies with the city manager, and then the tax exemptions, council has to pass a resolution for each project
Right.
to support a tax exemption.
Thanks.
So unless someone else wants to get in the queue, I wanted to follow up on Councilor Taylor's remarks about the single-room occupancy, and I don't know if efficiency apartments is the same or similar, but we as a council have focused a lot on the MUPD, the multifamily housing, and trying to incentivize more of that. But I do think I would like to see, as you guys scope out this plan, you look at the need for a single-room occupancy or efficiency-style apartment, because my understanding is the ones we have that are not connected with a program are full, and if someone leaves, they rent. And so I think there is still a real need to create just market-based housing that anyone can apply to, that they don't have to be connected with a particular social service program. If we built some more of them, they still maybe could serve that purpose as well. But I agree with Councilor Taylor. I think there's a gap there between multifamily housing and affordability and this need for, a single veteran who doesn't have family that he needs to provide for but would like to have an affordable place to live. I think that could fill a real gap. So I'd love to hear more about that as a potential strategy as you keep working on this plan.
And I think to really kind of move that forward, we would need to work with our development partners to see if we can get them to bring forward proposals. I will say that as we look at the overall number of units that were developed, more than half were one-bedroom studios or single-room occupancy units in the past 5-year period. So we do continue to hear a need for that in the community. I will also mention that we have heard a need from some providers for large family units also, and so we kind of see this sort of two ends of the spectrum of the need, and so it's certainly something that we've been paying attention to.
Great. Anyone else want to speak? All right. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. Really appreciate the work and the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So we are adjourned.
Good job.